welcome to this edition of Performance Cafe. And today we have a very special coffee companion with us, my friend Janhendrick Oosthuizen. Now, Janhendrick and I are going to be talking to you today about his public speaking initiatives. When he's not doing public speaking, he's the Chief Vision Officer of the Reimagine Group of creative agencies, which includes the advertising agency Etiquette, as well as the advertising incubator Sum of 21. And we're going to be talking today about his talk, Atomic Leaders. So let's see what that's about. Hi, Jan Hendrik.
Good morning. How are you doing?
I am well, thanks, and happy that summer's finally on its way. How are you?
I'm also good. I'm also good. Wonderful to be in September.
It is, isn't it? And a real September, a warm one. We always
Yeah.
joke about the ladies not being able to wear floral dresses on the 1st of September because it's always cold. Um, So, Jan Hendrik, we have to talk about this talk of yours. I know that it's important for you to help leaders reimagine their stories. Tell me, why is that? Why is this thing important? What does a story mean to me as a leader?
I think it's so important at the end of the day because what we are as humans and as a collective is a bunch of stories. We are formed by the stories that we tell, and we are formed by the stories that are told about us. And I do think that if we look at this collective story that we are creating as humanity, it is not per se always the best of stories at this stage.
Mm.
And for me, I'm on a mission to say we need to change the story. We need to look at the story that we create and this story that we're also passing on to our next generation. We need to make sure that that story is a great story, that story is a perfect story for a new generation to start off their own life story. And for me, if we talk about stories and if we talk about humanity's collective story, that must start with leadership. And there's so much that we need to do to change our leadership stories in order to start producing a new and a better collective story.
I love that. So I love the fact that we're starting with leadership because for me as a coach, there's a very important thing about self leadership. And I think we're going to get to that later about, who is a leader. But before we get there, leaders are all about performance, which is why you're with us today. So I wanted to ask you, do you think over the past 2 years, the story of performance has changed?
It definitely has. And I think if we talk about the last 2 years and if we look at what happened during COVID specifically, I see COVID and I see the past 2 years as the great reset, where companies had to reset first and foremost, and individuals had to reset. And we see that everywhere we look. We look, if you talk about the great resignation that takes place worldwide, also in South Africa, if you look at what companies do, how our work culture has changed, how the way that we work, our remote and our hybrid models, a lot of things have changed. And I think it is important to take that into consideration because with that change, a lot of people started to ask, how do we define things around us? How do we define performance on the one side? How do we define leadership on the other side? And now we start asking that question on two levels. We asked it on a personal level and we ask it on a corporate or a business level. And it's interesting how the answers that we get to that question at this stage differs drastically from what that answers were 2 years ago. So definitely this great reset had a massive influence on who and what we are.
And so I suppose the Great Reset also had a big effect or a big connection to how we see success.
Definitely. And if we talk about success, Innocent, it is, for me, a very subjective thing. Success is very personal. What I see as success and what you see as success most probably is completely different.
Mm.
And what makes that interesting is if we bring the corporate into play as well, what the corporate or the business or our company see as success and what we see as success also differs and aren't always aligned. And I do think in a corporate environment, the holy grail is definitely if we reach that point where we can bring what I as a person see as success and what the company see as success, if we can bring that into alignment. But I do think that's something that we don't see often, specifically from a corporate point of view, because a corporate defines success as what they want to achieve. And more often than not, personal success or personal success suffers due to that approach.
I love that. You're right. I mean, I don't love that it happens, but I love your thinking. Whoopsie. I love the way that you mentioned that is that there needs to be that alignment of how am I personally successful as well as how is the business successful that I work in. So let's come back to leadership. Leadership, I mean, let's be serious for a second. Leadership, you have to go to Ivy League school. You normally have to be male or a very assertive, strong, aggressive character. You must have worked at corporate senior level to be a leader, I'm sure.
It's spot on with regards to that. We've got a very interesting definition with regards to leadership and what we see as leadership. We believe that leadership is it's scarce, it's limited, and only an elite few people will ever be able to stand up as leaders. And
Mm,
I call those leaders the iconic leaders. And typically, as you say, it's that those people coming from ivory universities. It's the founders of our companies, the CEOs of our companies. It's those big
mm,
iconic leaders, and we love them. But we
mm,
do believe that leadership, you can only be a leader if you're one of those iconic leaders. And if you're not in your company, for example, if you're not already an iconic leader, the chances that you will become a leader becomes very, very little.
mm,
And it's that whole approach of leadership being scarce and leadership being exclusive that I call the big leadership lie. Because that is not what leadership is about. And I think it is, we've got a lot, or we need to do a lot in our corporates and our businesses to
mm,
change our definition of leadership, the way that we see leadership and the way that we approach leadership because
mm.
that definition is not serving us anymore at this stage. And we need to look at new ways of approaching leadership.
Now, I first want to ask you something that when I first listened to your talk was almost counterintuitive to me. And that was the cost of being an atomic leader. We see Jeff Bezos, we see Elon Musk, we see all these Oprah Winfrey is one of those. We see these incredibly successful people with oodles of money being invited to all the best places. They have massive houses, they have the opportunity to give their children and their families the best opportunities. And yet you say there's a cost. Tell us a bit about the cost of being iconic leader, a traditionally iconic
Iconic leader.
leader.
Absolutely. And look, we need these iconic leaders. They are the people that provide us with vision, with ambition. They inspire us and they show us the road. But what happens so often is that normal people then sit back and say, there's our iconic leader. In my company, my CEO or the founder is the iconic leader. And what starts to happen is I typically starts to idolize that iconic leader because they become larger than life. Now, as soon as I start to idolize the iconic leader, what happens? I start to become dependent on that iconic leader because it is, after all, that iconic leaders show. They are running the show, they are getting all the fame. So I'm becoming dependent on them. And with that dependency, my attitude becomes that if I'm dependent on them, I don't have to take ownership because they need to do everything. It is their show after all. They need to take direction, give direction, they need to guide me, and I don't have to take ownership. Now, what now happens is things starts to get very messy because the dependency leads to a lack of ownership in most employers and most ordinary people in their lives. I don't have to do anything because someone will take care of it. There's an iconic leader that will sort everything out. And I'm dependent on them. I don't have to take ownership. And what happens now is the iconic leader starts to turn around and say, okay, but why don't you take ownership? And how do they counter my lack in ownership? They start to micromanage me. Now, the
Mm.
problem is, as soon as an iconic leader
Mhm.
starts to micromanage me, what do? I sit
Okay.
back and say, okay,
Mm,
if you micromanage me, I'm going to take even less ownership and
mm,
I'm going to do even less work. And the less ownership I take, the more I micromanage. And the more I micromanage, the less ownership I take, and so on and so forth. And that becomes such a negative spiral. And as that spiral goes down, it leads to stuff like employment disengagement, which is massively high, and specifically in the South African context. And it's all because of a lack in
mm,
ownership, micromanagement, and this idealization of atomic leaders and of iconic leaders. And the
mm,
big problem is by doing this, we're also setting our iconic leaders up for failure. Because innocent, the reality is that if I don't do the work, all the heavy lifting is shifted to my iconic leader. He or she now needs to take control of everything. He or she now needs to do everything. And we see that all around us with high flying iconic leaders starting to crack, starting to fall apart because they can't take the pressure anymore. And we see so many iconic leaders that goes into fully fledged burnout because of how we see and how we approach leadership.
mm, mm. And I think that's the thing that to me really stood out is that we almost like two magnets pushing against each other instead of turning around and pulling towards each other. And when I first heard your talk, that's what I thought. It's like we don't realize it. It's like we're trying to come together, but we keep on pushing away instead of turning around. So the cost to the iconic leader is huge. I mean, you talked about burnout, which is something that we speak of often and has years worth of damage that it causes to people. Some people, years after, are still battling with it. But now you made a slip now, instead of saying iconic leader, you said atomic leader. So tell us a bit about what is an atomic leader?
That is exactly where my passion comes from. Because at this stage, what we need to do is we need to start spreading the leadership love. We need to understand that our iconic leaders cannot do this alone. They need to receive assistance, and they need normal, ordinary employees to also stand up and to claim leadership where they can and where it is possible.
Mm,
And I think what is so important is by shifting this focus in our companies away from the single iconic leader to many ordinary employees who also stands up and start to lead, not because their title expects it from them or because they are pushed to take leadership, but rather because they are answering the calling in their hearts.
mm,
We need to break this view that leadership is limited to a small group of people. And it's time to change our leadership models away from relying on or on being dependent on single big iconic leaders and starting to embrace what I call atomic leadership, as you said. Now, for me, what is an atomic leader? An atomic leader is an ordinary person, an ordinary employee who gets out of his or her comfort zone to become a leader in their own right and on a micro level. An atomic leader is someone who understands the incredible impact that results from taking leadership when the situation requires it. An atomic leader accepts responsibility and gets his or her hands dirty and change or fix what he or she must without first waiting for someone else to take the lead. And Innocent, my feeling is that our businesses need an army of atomic leaders that will help carry the leadership responsibilities. And to do that, we must realize that each employee can and must be a leader in his or her own right. We need to understand that leadership has nothing to do with titles, with positions or promotions, but rather with taking responsibility and action when the circumstances require it.
So, if I hear you right, you're saying that if I'm one of a team of five people, I can be a leader even without a official title. How do I know to take that leadership?
That's beautiful that you ask that, because that is the realization that we need to get to. Leadership is not a title, leadership is a choice. You choose to be a leader, you choose to stand up. And by doing that, you take ownership and you start to perform and you start to help and you start to contribute. And it's in that whole context that we need to start changing our definition of leadership. Because what we always think is, and you mentioned you're part of a group of five. Now, our whole approach is that, okay, there's a group of five employees or colleagues, and only one of those people can stand up and be the leader. And now Peter already stood up, and Peter is the leader. Now I can't be the leader. Now I sit back and do nothing because I'm not
Mm,
the leader. That is our definition of leadership. That is how we approach leadership. What I'm saying is that if you're an atomic leader in that group of five employees that you refer to, it doesn't mean that you need to stand up and lead in every single situation and in all the circumstances. What atomic leaders does is they lead in their area of speciality, in their area of passion and purpose. So it means that if I know that I'm strong in this element, I can lead in this element. But in that group of five, I know that Peter is better doing Y, and he will then focus on Y. And Innocent is good in rallying the troops. So let her take leadership when the troops need to be rallied. In
mm,
that instance, all five of us are atomic leaders. We just focus on different elements within our context or within our situation. A leader is not one single person with a title. Leadership is all of us working together and taking leadership in our own microcosm and there in our own environment where we can make a difference. How big or small that difference or that environment is doesn't matter. Just take leadership and stand up and make a difference.
mm. So, Jan Hendrik, an interesting thing here now. I get where you're going, but it sounds really sort of abstract. Give me an example of how it's worked in real life.
Perfect. And usually, when people ask me to explain the concept of atomic leader, who is atomic leader? I, excuse me, I start with the story of Verona. Now, Verona was part of my own team a few years ago. And Verona was an account manager in my company. And her job was to look after our clients and to manage projects. Her official job description never had anything to do with training or people development. But even though she was not people orientated from a job description point of view, she was always the one that took all the juniors in the company under her wing. And she became the mentor and the coach to them, helping them to find their feet in a very, very demanding industry. Now, Verona was not a leader due to her title or her position, yet she acted upon an opportunity where she knew she could add value, even though no one expected it from her. So she didn't have the title of leading the juniors, but she did it because it came from her heart. And that made such a big influence in our company. All the juniors looked up to Verona because she stood up as an atomic leader.
Mm,
And that made the world's difference. And you know what? For me, that became very interesting. If I think back to my own company, I remember very little of the inputs and the actions and the stories of the people who were leaders in my company because of their position or title.
Mm.
But in contrast to that, there were ordinary team members, ordinary employees, people like Verona, who weren't leaders, but whose stories I will always remember because they made a true impact just because of the fact that they stood up when the situation and the circumstances required it.
I love the story of Verona. It just shows so naturally that extension from the account exec into sort of supporting and mentoring people.